There are people who stay, not because they benefit from staying, not because leaving would cost them something, just because staying is who they are. Isaiah Washington was that person for Frank Lucas. And Frank Lucas, who understood nearly everything about power and loyalty and human motivation, never fully understood that. Or maybe he understood it perfectly and just couldn't say so, couldn't find the language, couldn't afford the vulnerability, couldn't become, even for a moment, the kind of man who tells another man what his presence has meant. That silence cost Frank something he couldn't quantify, something he recognized too late, something he carried to his grave without resolution. This is the story of Frank Lucas's one loyal friend, and the thing Frank never told him. Isaiah Washington was born in Grange, North Carolina, in 1932, 2 years after Frank. They grew up on the same streets, attended the same church, learned the same lessons about poverty and limitation, and the particular smallness of being black in the rural South in the 1940s. They weren't close as children exactly, but they were connected in the way that people who share an origin are connected, by context, by the common knowledge of what life felt like in that specific place, at that specific time. Frank left Grange at 15. Isaiah stayed, not because Isaiah lacked ambition, not because he was afraid or limited or content with what Grange offered, but because his mother was sick and his family needed him, and the timing was never right. And then the timing had passed, and Isaiah Washington had become a man who'd built his life in the same small town where he was born. He worked, got married, had children, built what could be built within constraints available to a black man in rural North Carolina in the 1950s and 1960s. A decent life, not a spectacular one, but honest, consistent. He and Frank stayed in loose contact through the years. A letter occasionally, a visit when Frank came back to see his mother Mahaly. The kind of friendship that doesn't require constant maintenance because it's built on something older than maintenance, built on the shared knowledge of a specific beginning. Then Frank became Frank Lucas, and everything changed, and nothing changed. Isaiah heard about Frank's success the way most people from Grange heard about it, through the particular telephone of small-town gossip. Frank Lucas is in Harlem. Frank Lucas is doing well. Frank Lucas is doing very well. Frank Lucas is doing things people don't talk about directly, but everyone understands. Isaiah didn't judge. That was the first thing. In a world where Frank Lucas collected judgments from law enforcement, from competitors, from moralists and community leaders, and eventually from the federal government, Isaiah Washington simply didn't offer one. He visited Frank in New York in 1967. Frank was 36. The empire was building momentum. Blue magic was establishing itself as the superior product. The Italian families hadn't yet understood what was happening. Frank was at the beginning of his most powerful decade. He picked Isaiah up from the Port Authority bus terminal in a car that cost more than Isaiah earned in 5 years. Isaiah got in, looked at the car, looked at Frank. "You always did have expensive taste," Isaiah said. Frank laughed, genuine laughter, the kind that was already becoming rare in his life. Because powerful men don't laugh easily, can't always afford to. Too many people watching, too many reads being made about what the laughter means. With Isaiah, Frank laughed, because Isaiah wasn't reading him for advantage, wasn't calculating what Frank's laughter revealed, was just his friend from Grange in a very expensive car in New York City, making an observation. They spent 3 days together. Isaiah asked no questions about the business. Didn't ask where the money came from, or how the operation worked, or what Frank was building exactly. Not because Isaiah was naive. He wasn't. But because some things don't require asking. And because Isaiah decided, consciously or not, that his friendship with Frank wasn't contingent on the details. He came back to Harlem the next year. And the year after that, annual visits that became part of the rhythm of Frank's life, something to look forward to, something uncomplicated in a world that was becoming increasingly complicated. Isaiah never asked for anything. That was the second thing. In Frank's world, everyone wanted something. The dealers wanted territory. The corrupt cops wanted money. The Italian families wanted submission. The suppliers wanted assurance. Julie wanted security. His brothers wanted more. Even the people who loved Frank wanted something from him. Isaiah wanted nothing. Showed up, had dinner, talked about Grange, asked about Mahaly, made Frank laugh, went back to North Carolina. Frank recognized this as extraordinary, knew it was rare, but never said so, because saying so would have required a kind of acknowledgment Frank hadn't learned to give. He showed it instead in the way that people who can't say things show them. Sent money to Isaiah occasionally, more than occasion required. Sent gifts for Isaiah's children at Christmas. Made sure that if Isaiah ever needed something, the door was open. Isaiah accepted this with the grace of someone who understood what was being communicated, without requiring it to be spoken. They had an understanding without words, a friendship that operated below the level of language. Then 1975 came, the FBI raid. Frank arrested in front of his daughter, the empire collapsing. Isaiah learned about the way everyone in Grange learned about it, from the news, from the television. Frank Lucas arrested, federal charges, 70 years potential sentence. Isaiah called Mahaly first, not Frank's lawyers, not Frank's associates. Mahaly made sure she was all right, asked what she needed, arranged for a neighbor to check on her regularly. Then, 3 weeks after the arrest, Isaiah Washington got on a bus from Greensboro to New York and went to visit Frank in federal holding. Frank was in the process of making the worst and most necessary decision of his life, the cooperation deal, the names, everything he was about to give up to reduce his sentence from 70 years to 15. He was not in a condition to receive visitors cheerfully. When Isaiah walked into the visiting room, Frank stared at him for a moment, then looked away, then looked back. "What are you doing here?" Frank asked. "Visiting my friend." Isaiah said, simply, "I'm about to become a rat. You know that? To save myself, I'm going to give up everyone I've ever worked with." "I know. That doesn't bother you?" Isaiah sat down across from Frank, thought about the question, answered it honestly. "I don't have an opinion about your business decisions. I'm not here about your business. I'm here because you're my friend and you're in trouble." Frank looked at him, trying to find the angle, trying to understand what Isaiah wanted from this visit, what he was positioning himself for, what the calculus was. There was no calculus. That's what Frank finally understood. Sitting in a federal holding room with a man who'd taken a bus from North Carolina for no reason except that his friend was in trouble. "You're an idiot for coming here," Frank said. "Probably," Isaiah agreed. "This is going to be in the newspapers. People see you visiting me. They'll assume you're connected. Let them assume." Frank. Isaiah's voice was quiet, but final. "I didn't come here to be talked out of coming here. I came here because that's what you do. Now tell me what you need." Frank needed a lot of things in that moment. He needed the charges to disappear. He needed his daughter not to have seen what she'd seen. He needed to not be choosing between 70 years and betraying everyone who trusted him. He needed Bumpy Johnson to still be alive. He needed to have made different choices 15 years ago. None of those things were available. What was available was Isaiah Washington sitting across from him in a federal visiting room, asking what he needed. "I need this to be over," Frank said finally. "I know. It will be eventually. 15 years if the deal goes through. Then I'll be here when you get out." Frank looked at him. "You're serious. When have I ever not been serious?" And that was it. No dramatic declaration. No speech about loyalty or friendship or the things that matter when everything else falls apart. Just, "I'll be here when you get out." Frank went to prison, served his time, cooperated with the government, named his brothers and his associates and his corrupt police connections, did what he had to do to reduce 70 years to 15. And Isaiah Washington, true to his word, came to visit, not every month. He had a life in North Carolina, a family, work, but regularly, consistently, without being asked, without any expectation of return. He sat in prison visiting rooms with Frank Lucas for 15 years, talked about Grange, talked about Mahaly, talked about his own children growing up, his grandchildren arriving, talked about nothing and everything, maintained a thread of connection between Frank and the ordinary world outside. Other visitors came and went. Julie stopped coming after a while. Their relationship was complicated by everything Frank had done and everything prison made harder. His daughter Francine came occasionally, with the reluctant obligation of a child trying to maintain connection with a father who had broken things that couldn't be fully repaired. Isaiah just came, regularly, reliably, without drama, without accounting, without the complicated emotional weight of someone who'd been hurt by Frank's choices. Because Isaiah hadn't been hurt by Frank's choices. Isaiah's life in North Carolina had continued independent of Frank's empire and Frank's arrest. He had his own sorrows and struggles and joys that had nothing to do with blue magic or the FBI or federal holding facilities. He came because Frank was his friend. That was the entire reason. When Frank was released in 1990, Isaiah was there. He'd driven up from North Carolina, was standing outside the prison gate. When Frank walked out, Frank stopped when he saw him, 59 years old, free for the first time in 15 years. And his friend from Grange was standing there with a thermos of coffee and a particular expression of someone who has been waiting patiently and is glad the wait is over. They drove together toward New York. Isaiah at the wheel, Frank in the passenger seat, looking out at a country that had changed while he was gone. Neither of them spoke much for the first hour. There wasn't much to say that hadn't already been communicated through 15 years of visits. Eventually Frank said, "You didn't have to do all that." "I know," Isaiah said. "The visits. All those years. You didn't have to." "I know that too." "Why did you?" Isaiah thought about it. "Because you're my friend. And you would have done the same." Frank wasn't sure that was true. He thought he would have done the same. Hoped he would have. But he'd also made choices throughout his life that suggested his own survival might win out over loyalty when the cost got high enough. His brothers could confirm that. But he didn't say any of that. Just nodded. "I appreciate it," Frank said. 3 words. "I appreciate it." 15 years of consistent, unconditional, uncomplicated presence. And Frank's acknowledgment was 3 words. Isaiah accepted him the way he accepted everything about Frank, with equanimity, without requiring more. Because Isaiah had never required Frank to be more than Frank was capable of being. They stayed in touch in the years after Frank's release, less frequent than the prison visits, which made a kind of sense. Prison imposed structure on contact. Freedom makes contact optional, and optional things happen less often. But Isaiah came to New York sometimes. Frank went to North Carolina occasionally. They talked on the phone, maintained the thread. Frank rebuilt something of a life, gave interviews, appeared in documentaries, watched himself become a character in a Hollywood movie, tried to contribute something useful in the years remaining. And through all of it, Isaiah Washington was there, in the background, not featured in any interview, not mentioned in any documentary, not played by anyone in the Hollywood movie. Just a man from Grange who had been Frank's friend for 60 years and had never asked for anything in return. Isaiah Washington died in 2011, 80 years old, in North Carolina, surrounded by his family, his grandchildren, the life he'd built in the place where he was born. Frank learned about it by phone, sat with it for a long time. He went to the funeral, drove down to North Carolina, sat in the back of the church, didn't speak, wasn't part of the formal ceremony, just sat there. Afterward, Isaiah's daughter Margaret found him outside. "Mr. Lucas," she said, "my father talked about you. Often. Good things, I hope. He said you were his oldest friend, said you were complicated and sometimes difficult, and that he never fully understood some of the choices you made." She paused. "But he said you were loyal in your own way, and that your friendship was one of the real things in his life." Frank stood with that, one of the real things. In the car driving back to New Jersey, Frank thought about what he'd never said. All the visits, all the years, all the moments when Isaiah had shown up simply because Frank was his friend. Frank had never told him what that meant, never found the language, never allowed himself the vulnerability of saying, "You are the only person in my life who never wanted anything from me. You are the only relationship I had that wasn't built on some form of transaction. You are the only person I can say loved me without reservation or agenda. You saved me from something. I'm not sure what exactly, but something, some complete isolation, some total reduction of human contact to utility. You kept something alive in me that I didn't know how to keep alive myself. Frank never said any of it. Not in 60 years of friendship. Not in 15 years of prison visits. Not in the car driving back from the prison gate. Not on any of the phone calls or visits that followed. He thought it, knew it, felt it in a particular way that men who can't express things feel them, intensely, privately, without outlet. But he never said it. And now Isaiah was gone. And the thing Frank had never said had nowhere to go. That was the weight Frank carried in his final years. Not the empire, not the prison, not the cooperation, not the brothers he'd named. All of that had weight. All of that was real. But this was different. This was the weight of love without expression, of gratitude without acknowledgment, of a friendship that deserved more words than it ever received. Frank Lucas died in 2019, 88 years old. In his papers, his family found a note, written at some point in his final years. Short, in Frank's handwriting. It said, "Isaiah, you stayed. I never told you what that meant. I should have told you. I'm sorry I didn't. It meant everything." 3 sentences, written in private, never sent, never spoken. The thing Frank finally said when there was no longer anyone to say it to. That was the real cost. Not the millions lost or the freedom taken or the empire collapsed. But this, a friendship that deserved acknowledgment and received silence. And a man who learned too late that saying the true thing is its own kind of power, the only kind that can't be taken. Isaiah stayed. Frank never told him what that meant. And that silence was the one thing Frank couldn't cooperate his way out of, couldn't reduce through any deal, couldn't undo with any amount of time or intention. It just remained, as truth always remains, waiting for the words that never came.